This video is about the generate attributes operator. This operator creates new attributes within example sets. There's a lot of detail associated with this operator, covered in a number of videos. This video covers using macros. We'll look at how to use macros, what happens if your macro is a number, what happens if it's a string, how to create different attribute names from macros, how to combine macros and functions, and some more complex use cases. As usual, here's a simple process. So this process creates some data which is passed to the generate attributes operator. The data is very simple. It's 3 regular attributes and a label. The generate attributes creates 9 new attributes. Here they are. We'll look at the details of these shortly. You notice there's a new construct here, % open squiggly bracket name and then close squiggly bracket. That denotes that that text is a macro. RapidMiner uses that then to substitute the value of the macro in the expression to create the attribute. To see the values of the macros that's actually created in this sub-process here, I'll run the process once. If we go back to the design view, you'll see that the macros are here. 3 macros have been created. The first one's called an attribute name, it has the value @1. The second is called number, it has the value 2.100. The third is called string and has the value a string. So as in previous videos, I'll run this, and what I'll do is I will align the statistics view of the example set with the definition of the attributes, and we can go down them one by one to see how the results are created. I'll pause the video and arrange all that. So here are the results. We'll work down these attributes one by one. So the first one has the name numeric attribute, and its value is taken from the macro called number, which, as you can see down here, has the value 2.10. So sure enough, RapidMiner interprets that as a number, and therefore the attribute becomes real in the output set, in the example set. The next one down is polynomial attribute. That has the value %string, which is a macro. So in other words, RapidMiner substitutes the macro here for the string a string, and you'll notice it's in double quotes. This signals to RapidMiner that this is a string. If those double quotes are missed off, you'll see shortly, you get a different behavior. If you look at the result here, polynomial attribute, it has the value a string, and it's nominal. The next one, the third one, is what happens if the macro you use is not defined. So what happens is, if it's exactly the same as the one above, but this macro doesn't exist, and you can see here that the macro doesn't exist, you actually get, I'll move this to the right a bit, you'll see that the text undefined macro name is placed in there, so it becomes polynomial, which is just something to bear in mind if you accidentally use a macro that hasn't been defined. You saw in previous videos that if you use an attribute's name in the function expression, RapidMiner will use the value of that attribute to determine the value of the new attribute. So this is what's happening here. I'm using an attribute name, which is actually a macro, to create this new attribute called value from another attribute. So, working through this, an attribute name, as you can see, it's set to @1. Just off the top of the screen here, @1, there is an attribute called @1. So what happens is RapidMiner substitutes @1 in here. That is an attribute, so that therefore becomes the value of value from another attribute. If I show you @1, here it is. @1 has these characteristics, min, max, average, and you can see that value from another attribute has them as well. In other words, value from another attribute is simply a copy of @1. So I've brought back the function descriptions. Now we'll look at attribute name not used. This attribute is similar to the one above, but the only difference is the double quotes. And this is the important point. The double quotes means that RapidMiner treats it as a string, and won't try and use it as an attribute. You'll notice the previous one, this value from another attribute, that was @1, that had no double quotes around it, so therefore RapidMiner assumed it was an attribute and looked it up and found an attribute and then substituted that value. For this one, you'll notice that there's double quotes, so if we look at the actual value of the attribute now in the result, you'll see it's called attribute name not used and it's @1. And that's simply because the next two macros put double quotes around it here. You can put quotes around the expanded macro name. That's the one called attribute name with quotes, and basically you escape the double quote in order to make it appear in front of the attribute after the macro, rather, after the expansion. And the second one is called attribute with macro delimiters. In this case, the macro is not expanded, and you can see what I'm doing is I'm constructing it by adding together different bits of the string, and by doing it this way the macro is not expanded. Unlikely you'd want to do it, but shown for completeness. This next attribute is macros everywhere, and this is an example of a more complex function based on the if function, and macros are being used in all parts of this. So if we go through this closely, the first part is it tests to see if an attribute name, the macro an attribute name, which if you remember is set to @1, which is actually an attribute. So it's actually saying if @1 is greater than 5, then this part of the if will be returned. So in this case, number, the macro number, will be returned. So in other words, if @1 is greater than 5, the result of this statement will be 2.100. If @1 is less than 5, then the result is a string. So let's cancel that and let's look at the actual results to see that in action. I'm going to scroll over here. This is the attribute that we're looking at, and I'm going to move this all the way over to here. If I expand this out, now you're seeing that basically whenever @1 is greater than 5, the result is 2.100. If it's less than or equal to 5, then it's the result a string. Now you're going to say to yourself, well, there's a combination of nominal and real there. How does RapidMiner cope with that? The answer is it defaults it always to a nominal, which is, you can sort of see that if I bring back this, you'll see that actually I've put all of the macros in double quotes. If I were to put that in a single quote, it would probably fail. Final attribute is actually an example where you can use a macro to create the attribute name. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating an attribute called new underscore an attribute name, where an attribute name is a macro. Now in this case it's @1, so what we should see is, sure enough, there it is, an attribute called new underscore @1, and all I'm doing is basing it on the value of @1. So that's the same really as this one here. So what we should see is new underscore @1 will be a copy of @1. Let's have a look at that. Go back to the data view, scroll over, new @1, drag it all the way across to here. Sure enough, hopefully you can see that every time @1 exists, the new @1 exists with the same value. So in conclusion, I'll bring up the statistics view and the function descriptions.